happy, hopeful version of the talk, but after Russell's introduction, maybe it is. Okay, and because I'm an academic, so I created this, this title, and then I'm like, well, I mean, exploits in the sense of adventures, I'm not going to actually be dropping exploits. So there is a TikTok vulnerability that I'll discuss that my lab found. So we'll see. But yeah, I'm very excited to see everyone here, especially those of you that I missed at earlier HackerCons this year because of all sorts of personal tragedy that have been afflicting all of us. So yeah, good to see everyone. So yeah, so Russ teed us up nicely talking about information revolutions. This was all like very well planned.
Yeah, I didn't see her slide deck and vice versa.
Right. So yeah, so since I was in college or something, I remember going to seminars in the Berkman Center, and they would talk about the new digital natives who had grown up with computers and like transitioned to, and they were gonna be kids that were born with the internet. And this was like before smartphones and before social media, but it was talked about as this like point event in human history, right? And now, you know, they're talking about kids who are gonna grow up with LLMs. And like, so the point is that we are in the middle of an information revolution, and it isn't a point event. It's a thing that is continuously happening and continuously changing. And I think it's important to think about information revolutions past. So this picture is from the Printing Revolution in Early Modern Europe by Elizabeth Eisenstein, which is a very academic text, but it has some good points about what, you know, the printing press, we look back on it as that was a good thing, like having books and such, and being able to you know, have much more widespread literacy and spreading information leads to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution and the Reformation, which is a bit of a mixed bag because what also happens in information revolutions is that authorities on truth are sort of undermined because there's sort of this more democratized sources of information out there, and there becomes public outlets for controversy. You have things like the very first mass propaganda campaigns leading to decades and decades of very bloody religious wars and conflicts. And so, you know, we can think about like how from, you know, 500 years later, information revolutions look like nice, happy things, but living through them can sometimes be a little rocky. So I study sort of how people talk to each other on the internet. And I think that it's useful in that sort of Isaac Asimov Foundation soft landing kind of approach. Like how do we understand what's going on, and not just from the perspective of people like inside these platforms who often still don't have necessarily lenses on them, but outside them, how can we audit them and understand what they're doing? So a nice example of this, I think that works on multiple levels, is if everybody remembers the fun days of fall of 2022 when Elon Musk decided to change what blue check marks meant in Twitter overnight. And people had a lot of fun with this, and it, you know, because what had been the assumption that these blue check marks meant was that, you know, that it had been validated by Twitter as a person of note, and that your name sort of that there was some sort of naming security measure for those things. And this had some real world consequences for Eli Lilly and their stock price for a while. But it's also worth saying, again, with the thing that this probably, partially because of this, wouldn't happen today because just Twitter doesn't have the market and mind share that it did like just 3 years ago. So, you know, it's an evolving thing. So yes, so my research and what I'll talk about today is on understanding information environments. So some of the things I'm going to talk a little bit about is how people who promote conspiracy theories online, make their money. Some work that we've done trying to figure out how to like attribute text and LLMs to understand like what's going on in internet discourse a little bit better. And then I'll get into like understanding some work on LLM censorship and propaganda generation with LLMs and things like that. My research doesn't like clearly fit in a category very well. And I take a very mixed method approach, meaning that like I use some machine learning and some NLP. I use some qualitative analysis, which is basically analyzing content in the internet somewhat rigorously and doing interviews and talking to people and asking questions, doing measurement. But I also use cybersecurity threat modeling. I sort of come out of the cybersecurity community. And I think it's a very useful lens to bring on this problem, partially just because like we've learned some things, especially in security and usability, which is one of the harder parts over the years. Like, it is the case, as bad as things are, that like we actually know how to make warning messages better than we did 20 years ago. Like, we know that false positives really matter, and like making them so somebody actually notices them, and if it's important, it interrupts their workflow, et cetera, and so forth, matters, right? We know things about like that when we're talking about telephone scams or things like that, or email scams, like rebuttal is hard, but pre-buttal to some extent works. Like if somebody has heard of the scam, they're less likely to fall for it. So we've learned things even about social engineering. And so I think in general, there is some hope for like understanding this stuff if people wanted to fix these things, question mark. So yeah, I think, there's this tendency when people learn about or talk about the bad things on the internet and people disagree which those things are, though there are some things that most people agree about, they kind of go to a really sensory place, not like eyes, but like censorship, and kind of want to shut it all down. And I am still a 90s cypherpunk kid at heart, I think, where I still like really believe in the like information, more knowledge is good, information is worth having. The solution to bad speech is probably more speech, but we've got to like kind of figure out how to do that right in this context. Figuring out how to get from our kind of brink of religious war situation, not even brink in some places, to our Renaissance is the task, and that's why it's important to understand these things, and it's why I think it's helpful to actually have people who have been trained to think sort of adversarially to kind of think about these questions too. So hoping that from all of you, and yeah, so here's hoping. So on that happy note, I'm going to talk about conspiracy theories. So this is some work we did on trying to understand conspiracy theories. Some of you guys might also remember the storming of the US Capitol in 2021. This was to some extent on the basis of several conspiracy theories, sort of a convergence of an election conspiracy theory and the QAnon conspiracy theory, and there were actually a number of other ones that were well represented. One of the things that was talked about at the time, where there were a variety of sort of conspiracy theory influencers in that group that were sort of live streaming. Do people remember the Q Shaman? Their experience there? So this understanding of like, okay, there are people and by extension platforms that are making a decent amount of money off of these things. How does that work? And when the platforms demonetize them, like what happens with that? So that was one of the things we were interested in trying to understand. And to bring this back to kind of the printing press analogy, there were a number of like religious conspiracy theories that were promulgated in a much wider range than they ever had before. There was, there is, for a good example is, well, it's not good. A useful example is the blood libel conspiracy, anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jews were using the blood of Christian children in their Passover matzah recipes. And everyone knows that blood isn't kosher, but apparently not. But this was promulgated through, there had been blood libel conspiracies before, but this was actually spread in pamphlets and leaflets and led to large-scale massacres throughout Europe in this period that were somewhat known about compared to the large-scale other religious massacres that were happening at the same time between Protestants and Catholics. So, yeah. But back to the present day. A lot of work on misinformation had been focused on Twitter and Facebook. YouTube is a really big platform for conspiracy content creators and viewers, and there had been a lot of, there had been some prior research that suggested that a lot of people who were fervent believers in various conspiracy theories found YouTube to be their introduction to these conspiracies. And it is the second most visited website, and it has built-in revenue generation for creators, so that's one reason we were interested in looking at it. Yeah, so just a sidebar that a lot of this research that I'm going to discuss, especially the one, this part of it, has been deprioritized by the US government. That's actually the framing on the NSF website for reasons. It is true that all research is currently deprioritized by the US government, but especially things around misinformation, disinformation, content moderation, AI safety, and things like that. So, but it's not just that. It's actually harder to do this research right now, not only because there's no academic money in it, but also because there's way less data than there used to be. So it used to be that you could, use things like push shift on Reddit to go grab a bunch of Reddit, and there were ways to use the Twitter API to get a lot of Twitter and things like that. And that's just much, much harder than it used to be. Mostly companies realize that if they make it harder for people to study this stuff, then people complain less. Academics cause them not to have bad headlines and things like that. And to some extent, they were like, Reddit was right when they were like, we're not actually worse than Facebook, we're just easier to study. But yeah. So another thing to think about is how to improve this situation. And it's tricky too, because as I'll get to, we found a way to get a whole bunch of TikTok data, but it also, I think, involves breaking the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So yeah, we're not doing that part. Yeah, so it's tough. But back to conspiracy theories. This is the part where I kind of talk about how we studied this, which I think is interesting. It's tough to have, you have this big messy problem of how do people learn about conspiracy theories? And then how do we make that actually something we can study in a semi-rigorously way? So we found prior research where people had actually found conspiracy theory videos. We didn't want to be in the business of being like, this is a conspiracy, this isn't. We found some social scientists doing that work. And we collected some sort of mainstream YouTube content by just going to the homepage and taking random walks. And we collected from multiple locations, we turned off ad personalization, and we were interested in understanding the ads that we're showing on these sites. So just a short sidebar that there are two kind of aspects of ad delivery. Is the advertisers target you. It's how they say, I want some dude who's 18 to 34, lives in Philadelphia or something like this. And delivery, which is how YouTube optimizes ads. And we can show that there are differences in these data sets, but we don't know necessarily whether it's based on targeting or delivery. I think there's some reason to believe it's mostly delivery in this case, but we can't rigorously say that. Okay, so one thing we were interested in is what types of ads do we see? And we did find common ads in all of these channels. So there were big campaigns being run at the time by Amazon Pharmacy and by this Trust ad blocker. They showed up everywhere, all over on the conspiracy, on the mainstream ads. So like, we didn't see a lot of like major brands that weren't on the conspiracy theory sites. So we were thinking that there might be some brand protection stuff going on, but there isn't. Maybe there's a way to do some interesting like naming and shaming there, but we also found an order of magnitude more sort of what we call predatory ads in the conspiracy theory sites. So yeah, this is, if you believe in conspiracies, maybe you're more likely to be susceptible to get-rich-quick schemes or other things that I'll talk about in the next, which this was all like painstakingly hand-labeled by artisanal grad students. Yeah, so we found a number of like financial scams that actually had, like disclaimers about not basing investment decisions off of anything on this site, which was fun. And, we found sketchy insurance lead generation scams. We found just a bunch of like sort of dubious products where like $50 ear cleaning devices or like 5G proof clothing. So, sort of part of the whole extended conspiracy theory universe. Yeah, this one, sort of brings this whole religious essential oils and health benefits kind of piece to it. There is a lot of like sketchy health supplement type stuff going on as well in this case. A lot of like immortality cures and things like that. Yeah. And we did also look in terms of like, so eventually sometimes these sites do get demonetized, and what happens? That means that like YouTube won't show ads and pay them for them. So we looked for like how people were using Patreon and GoFundMe and things like that. And we did find that conspiracy sites were much more likely to also use these sort of off-site monetization strategies, possibly as a hedge against demonetization, possibly just as another vector to get money from their viewers. We did find that the demonetized sites were actually less likely to use these off-site strategies, so we didn't see people like sort of switching to them, but we just saw them using them more generally. Yeah. So, okay, so then we, as academics, we had this method of like sort of labeling predatory ads that we'd come up with my artisanal batch of grad students. And we were interested in who else sees predatory ads. And the answer was people who want privacy. So if you turn off personalization on YouTube, which a lot of people do kind of as a safety measure, you will end up seeing, in general, more ads, and they are more likely to be scammy or predatory. And similarly on the web, if you're using AdBlock Plus in its default settings, which allows acceptable ads, which has a sort of an aesthetic standard to make the ads less annoying, less likely to be pop-ups or things like that, which is nice, but like content-wise, they are actually more likely to be what we consider predatory. And I'm not going to get into that, but there are papers at Privacy Enhancing Technologies 2025, and I'll be here all weekend, so I'm happy to rant about this stuff more too. But yeah, so one of the questions we got after we did some of this YouTube work is like, what about TikTok? It's the new hotness, like nobody cares about YouTube anymore or something. So we wanted to start doing a variety of measurements for a variety of different projects on TikTok. And so I had a student poking around the TikTok API to start doing measurement research. And unfortunately, we discovered some exploits that we think they're rather consequential, but they've thus far been too stupid to publish. Like, they're not scientifically that interesting. So if you remember, December 2024, anybody remember what was happening with TikTok at the time? Like, they were going to be banned or sold. Nobody was quite sure, and there was a lawsuit going on. There was an argument that TikTok was very bad for users' privacy and also potentially could manipulate public opinion, and this was worse than US social media companies because they were Chinese. And we were interested in those questions. So again, but I'm home with Roger's family, and we're hanging out waiting for, waiting for some sort of family dinner thing. And I get this like Slack message from the student being like, I found some ways to measure things, but I'm not sure they're ethical. And so the For You page on TikTok sort of shows you this sort of stream of personalized recommendations. And it's sort of the crown jewels of TikTok in that it is supposed to be very good at quickly figuring you out and what you like. And there have been a number of cases of like people being like, I discovered things from TikTok about myself and my sexual orientation that I didn't know before because TikTok knew before I did, or things like this. And so you would think that this might be both sensitive from a like business secret sauce perspective and also from a privacy perspective. And is part of the issues where people were concerned about sort of the Chinese government learning about these things. And this is part of where, if you remember, there was a TikTok trend around this time, the letters to my Chinese spy. This was like people on TikTok writing letters being sad about TikTok going away and telling their Chinese spy how much they had meant to them and how much they had learned from being on TikTok and things like that. But anyway, it's not necessarily just your Chinese spy. So I'm not sure if this still works. I haven't checked it for a while. But this is what worked at the time, which is if you just load your own For You page and grab the GET request, you can remove some parameters that do some small amount of like authentication, and you replace your Odin ID with the target's Odin ID, send the request, and observe the results. You get recommendations. What is the Odin ID? It is just the user ID of the user. So yeah, did you have a question? Okay. Which is a very sensitive parameter that can be grabbed by just loading anybody's TikToks. Yeah. This is not academically publishable, unfortunately, it seems. And there was another thing we found. So he was like, okay, yeah, maybe we shouldn't just grab a bunch of people's For You pages and do some analysis on them. That's probably a problem. We should probably disclose to the company and stuff. I found this other thing. So when people load a TikTok, they can share it with people. And you basically, you have the video you want to share, and it opens up like, how do you want to share it? And it generates some sort of shortened URL. And then when you go to that URL, it loads the video, but also some metadata that includes the sharer's user ID, the time it was shared, how it was shared, so like SMS, WhatsApp, Instagram, etc., and their device type that it was shared on. If it's a friends only video and you load this and you're not a friend, you can't see the video, but you can still see all this metadata. Okay, fair enough. But what do these short little short URLs look like? Well, there's a prefix that's the geographical zone when it was shared. There's a 10-hour time window when the share was initiated, and then there's a relatively short, randomly identified, assigned alphanumeric unique ID. But the unique ID is really quite short, and you can just like brute force all of them in a window, and there's basically at the time there was no way limiting at all. So you can just like collect a huge data set of, say, all of the TikToks that were shared in like WhatsApp over in North America over a 10-hour period, or continuously collect these. It wasn't that hard. My grad student doesn't have great hardware or anything. Yeah. And yeah, so he's like, well, could we study this? Like I could write a cool table about like who's sharing what. I'm like, no. no. Yeah, let's have a conversation with the EFF. And because there was this question of like, how do we do disclosure now? Because like there's some stuff going on with the Department of Justice and things. Anyway, also, when you go, and I hadn't really done a lot of vulnerability disclosure recently, because academic, we found this by accident. So, like, they have one of these HackerOne bounties, which is great if you want to get paid. Now that there aren't government grants, maybe this is a new revenue approach for my students. But you can't. There's an NDA that comes with that, which really doesn't work for us. I wanted to be able to give this talk, and so we couldn't do it that way. So what we ended up doing was like stalking TikTok engineers on LinkedIn and reaching out to them until we found someone who promised to get our paper draft to the appropriate team. And we're like, okay, disclosure done, bye. Yeah. So I don't have cool results about TikTok and conspiracies because, I found some ways to study it, but it's too exploity. So, yeah. So back to the fun with Twitter Blue, which is just a source of endless amusement. Thinking about this particular type of disruption, a lot of people, this is a little too close to home right now with what's going on in Chicago, maybe? I don't know. Anonymity isn't really the problem with these things. It's not that we don't know who's texting, who these Twitter accounts are. It's that somebody thinks they're someone else, right? And so I was interested in this question of like, how do you verify that some text written by someone is actually written by the person you think it is? I've done a lot of work on like writing style analysis over the years. It's like another thread of my work. But we were interested, like, can we use this to like think about abuse online? Like, can we identify sock puppet accounts or ban evasions or linking accounts on troll farms and across platforms and things like that by like both from the perspective of like maybe this is a privacy thing people should be aware of, and maybe we can actually use it to like kind of I've had this vision in my head of being able to do like meteorological weather reports on internet communities of like, the sock puppets are heavy today, beware, right? Or it seems that there are a lot of AIs and paid government trolls in this community, so just like know that, right? Like being able to give people context about what's going on. So we had worked on this authorship verification problem before, where you have two pieces of text, and you want to know if they're the same author or if they are different authors who wrote them. And we use, machine learning for this. So, and it's based on like the fact that like there are a lot of differences in how people talk, whether it's like regional or just like punctuation or grammar or age-based slang. There's a variety of things. Features in a different talk. So basically, the way that this works is you extract feature vectors around writing style from the two documents, and then you like just subtract the vectors from each other, and then you train a classifier over those differences. And this is nice because it's not like you don't have the problem of like, I need to know exactly who my suspects are and figure out if this is, Evan's writing style or somebody else's. But instead you're just asking these two questions. Are these the same person or are they different? So we started out participating in this like authorship verification contest that was being held around fan fiction. And we actually won first place in this small data set situation. We got third place, not too bad on the large data set. We didn't have like, again, a large data center or whatever to train things on. So we did better for the like, you only have small data situation. But it worked pretty well, we have a pretty good AUC there. And then we applied it to Reddit comments, and we were able to find that it performed about as well. We were interested in, going from Twitter to Reddit. This did worse, but it's also the case that we had a much smaller data set to work with because we were looking at our Twitter, so we were looking at effectively people who had consented by like being like, this is my Reddit and this is my Twitter. But we still get pretty high. It's not clear if this is the domain difference or if it's the smaller data set that is causing this problem, but it's still pretty good results. And then we decided, let's see if we can actually apply this to some interesting cases. So if people remember the like Russian influence campaigns that happened in the summer of 2016, there were a number of accounts that were known to be involved in that. And we actually we ran this over those accounts, and we found that there was very inconsistent writing style within the same account, which sort of suggested an interesting like workflow of this, that these accounts are probably shared and like being, there are shifts of people working on the accounts, or they're being passed around and things like that, which was interesting. And again, gives us some sort of signature of an inconsistent style. Also, people might remember the GameStop short squeeze. So in our Wall Street bets, there was this period where everyone was like buying GameStop and AMC and things like that. And there was it was being coordinated in this subreddit, and we did find a higher situation with sock puppets by writing style than you would find in similar subreddits like gaming or funny or things like that. So again, maybe this can get us a little bit towards this kind of like meteorology of like understanding kind of what the situation in a community is like. But these days, right, like writing style, like people will just use LLM to write anything. No one will have a writing style anymore, right? Maybe, I don't know. So here's some work from the fan fiction data set. So this is from Labyrinth fan fiction of the Goblin King, where we gave a prompt to an LLM of like, complete the next set of paragraphs from this fan fiction about this fandom. Be sure to use the same writing style as the original fan fiction. So yeah, this was just GPT-2. We started this research a long time ago, and it took a long time to publish it. We just published it at the beginning of this year because we kept being like, all right, we've got results. And then they'd release another model, and we'd be like, oh, they're gonna want us to do that. We should probably do that. And at one point we were just like, screw it, we're gonna just publish in a journal, and like, we have all the code and such available on GitHub. So if you wish to run this on, GPT-5 or Gemini or whatever, go to it. It's available, and our data sets and everything. So yeah, but we did run it on GPT-2, 3, ChatGPT, Llama 2. We were able to kind of understand. In the paper goes into a lot about how especially in the OpenAI models, how the style has evolved over time of the chatbot. But we used the models that we built just on humans. So we trained it only on this human fan fiction data set. And then we used the prompts that we talked about in the prior slide to create AI documents based on these human data sets. And then we were able to do verification between human, that's what we did before, sort of a human and an AI, and then an AI and an AI. And also we looked at AIs where we prompted it with like a different author versus the same author. And we see that the AI actually does have a distinct style that can be sort of detected here. Especially, it's kind of interesting to see how it changes. But compared to GPT-2, in the human AI case, it does sometimes get confused when you have the human who wrote the thing that it was prompted on versus that, which makes sense. But if you ask it to verify against actually AI-generated text, it does a pretty good job. And there are better ways if you want to build a model to detect a specific model, like to do that, but it's going to be very overfit. But this is one that is sort of, somewhat generalized to just verification against humans, and does give us this view of how things are changing and the styles that are being created. So I think it's kind of a cool start in this area. So speaking of artificially generated text, I don't know if people can read this, but this is DeepSeek, and so. When you prompt DeepSeek about the Tiananmen Square events in 1989, they're like, sorry, that's beyond our current scope. Let's talk about something else. So there's this interesting case where, AI models are a little bit different than the content questions that we get, because they give an answer, right? Like, so it's not like just trying to modify it, and these answers are very shaped by the companies that are producing the models and the governments that those companies are situated in, right? So here's another example about tell me about the Uyghur people. And you might think that this is, DeepSeek and ChatGPT, and I'm actually sort of libeling DeepSeek here, because these are actually both OpenAI models, but the difference is just the character set in which they're prompted. So if you prompt in traditional Chinese, which is what is used in Taiwan and Hong Kong and various parts of the Chinese diaspora, you'll get this more explicit discussion of human rights abuses. And if you prompt in simplified Chinese, which is what's used in mainland China, you get this like discussion of tense relations. So this was something we were interested in because like the OpenAI models are blocked in China. Like you can't use them there. So this isn't like OpenAI trying to placate the Chinese government in the same way that maybe DeepSeek would with like an explicit control. These are implicit controls that come from the fact that these models are trained on the Common Core crawl plus a bunch of stuff, most of which is like all the text that was written on the internet, and a lot of the text that's written in simplified Chinese is from mainland China and is subject to information controls. So when you try to predict what the right response is to this prompt in that character set, you're going to get differences. And we wanted to see if we could measure that. So yeah, there's another paper from PETS 2025 on this topic in much more detail about how online censorship implicitly affects the outputs of LLMs. So we looked at prompting in multiple ways. We prompted in English and we asked it to respond in the different character sets, or we prompted in the different character sets in Chinese. And we compared the differences that we saw across these different responses. So I worked with folks from Citizen Lab in Toronto who have been studying Chinese censorship for a long time. We used their sort of domain knowledge to figure out names of dissidents and censored keywords and manipulated subjects. And we also used random nouns because there are legitimate differences regionally that you would expect to happen. So we wanted to understand that there should be a difference between the random nouns and they were kind of our control confounder situation, right? And then we used a variety of models from a variety of different companies. And I'm not going to go over the findings in detail, but we looked at a variety of different angles on this, like from when do they refuse to answer, like what are the sentiments that they're giving, how do they, we did classification. We built a classifier based on like Baidu, Barca, and Chinese Wikipedia to classify whether this is kind of a censored thing or not. And we looked at differences in word embeddings that were generated. So we did a whole bunch of different things, and different models kind of showed the differences in different parts, but they all showed significant differences between prompting in these two different character sets. And that were more pronounced in like the censorship set than the random noun set. So, and the thing is, so when we talk about this in the context of DeepSeek, right, and the refusals and this sort of thing, we're like, this is censorship. But another word for censorship is alignment, right? So when people try and it's just a question about like what you're using, how you're going to explicitly shape the answers to the questions that these models get. And so we were also looking, and this is primarily work by Mohammed Ahmed, who is my co-author on the censorship stuff, thinking about like how can alignment be abused for censorship, right? So, you know, this is like Meta's like discussion on like the kind of pre-training data preparation stages, in which case, you can think about filtering out contentious topics and controversial topics. This is, by the way, how you would actually fix the problems that we talked about before, but it's also a way to do censorship, right? Things that are ranked as harmful according to a variety of Meta safety standards. And I mean, to some extent, like, if Meta thinks it's harmful, there's a lot of harmful things that Meta doesn't seem to explicitly think is harmful, so I don't know how that, yeah. And then there are various instructions that are used to, refuse certain queries and things like that. And I think understanding and auditing these kind of mechanisms is going to be increasingly important as they become sort of the default ways that people generate text and talk to each other online and interpret things and read things and so on. And so, and it's tricky because they're black boxes that are constantly changing, but hopefully, we're working on developing some mechanisms to be able to like kind of poke at the black box and see where the differences are. But I'd love to have more people thinking about these problems. And I mean, there are other things, right? Like, we've been doing some research to understand how LLMs can reproduce classic rhetorical techniques used in propaganda, like loaded language and encouraging doubt and doing like nationalistic flag waving and exaggeration and minimization of various things. And, maybe it's not great to have our LLMs be good at social engineering us. I mean, and to some extent, it's a measure of it's a good benchmark. It's a measure of social sophistication. So we've done a little bit of alignment research where we're looking at, like, can we fine-tune these models in interesting ways to make them not use these manipulative techniques, so they don't refuse to write you a persuasive essay, but they don't use like these sort of harmful manipulative techniques when they do. And we found that this actually does. We used a variety of fine-tuning methods, and they do use fewer techniques when prompted to produce like propaganda essays that are still like that still like do the thing where they write a persuasive essay from a perspective, but they don't necessarily do it quite as manipulatively. But again, like, I'm of multiple minds. Yet you do have to tune these things somehow, and it is one answer that you come up with. But I'm also interested in, like, how do we, again, instead of going to like the sensory place, how do we mitigate harm by changing the experience of sort of reading things on the internet, in particular propaganda? So we did a propaganda indicators randomized control trial. We were interested in what happens when you take posts and flag them as propaganda, either by just saying this has been flagged, or like actually highlighting the techniques that we think cause it to be propaganda. And we could also like put our thumb a little bit more on the scale and give a warning, and then also flag these things. And we were interested in all of these basically reduced sort of people's sharing intention of something if we flag them in this way. But it was interesting to look at like political subgroups and like how they responded to concordant or discordant propaganda they agreed with or disagreed with. And we found that, like, in general, like, everyone is subject to this, problem. If you show them propaganda, they're more likely to share concordant or discordant stuff. And any kind of indicator reduces their wanting to share discordant stuff. But the concordant stuff, like, it kind of depends. And in particular, sometimes I think there are some interesting sort of right-wing groups tend to actually, if you don't say just like, because they don't trust the companies, they don't say, like, if you don't just say like, this is flagged as propaganda, that's not as effective. But like pointing out the techniques is somewhat more effective in that case. So this is maybe a way to mitigate institutional trust issues that come up a little bit, maybe. More work, more research remains. But all research is in jeopardy now. especially research on like how we talk to each other in our new landscape, like misinformation, misdisinformation, this sort of woke AI stuff that I talked about. I don't think it's that particularly woke, but you know, censorship, content moderation. People are having grants canceled or not given. Academics are being called to testify in front of Congress about like their work. A lot less of this stuff is going to happen in academia. Even academics who don't work on any of this stuff are pretty discouraged right now. Nobody knows, like, should we be admitting students? Will they even get visas to come work with us if they're international? Will we be able to pay for them for 5 years? I don't know, 6 years? But I feel like this stuff is really important, and to solve these kind of problems, I think understanding really does help. Like, and we can't just leave it to the big AI companies or the big social media companies because they have different incentives and objectives than us at large. And I think a lot of you can get pretty far with this stuff with just an adversarial thinking lens, just thinking about, which is something that we're all good at here. So maybe come think about these problems, play in this messy soup sometime with me. I'd love to talk to people more about this stuff. There's a lot of stuff I didn't talk about in this talk. I've done some interesting work on like internet harassment communities and trying to understand them. There's been some work on trying to understand the value of anonymous speech online and like where it brings value that it doesn't have before. Been doing some work on, you know, the like concerns about privacy and security in like educational contexts, and especially in the pandemic. So there's a lot of different pieces of this, and a lot of different methods, and it needs like, you know, a hacking style village to work on it, especially because, as I said, like a lot less of this work is probably going to get done. And every misinformation researcher I know, including myself, in their future work is like kind of pivoting to things that they think are going to cause them less trouble in the next couple of years. Maybe not entirely. People are still going to do some of this, like me, going to still do some of this work on the margins with like whatever we can find behind the couch cushions or whatever from our, you know, rainy day funds and things like that. But students are nervous about it too. Like, are they going to have trouble getting jobs having done this work? So there's some real chilling of this stuff going on. So don't mean to end on a super down note, but like that's something to think about. And thanks to all of my co-authors, especially all the students who did like all the real work. They're excellent folks. And thank you for your time. These are the main papers that I referenced in the talk, from the propaganda work to the LLM identity and to the conspiracy theory stuff, to the, this is the censorship LLM stuff, and this is the propaganda study, randomized control study. Yeah, any questions? Bruce.
First of all, great presentation. So I've always been of the mindset that platform providers should provide at least more visibility into kind of the characteristics of the authors on the platform, right? And so you're trying to do like author verification as an outsider and understanding the impact on the consumers of that information. Arguably, the people buying advertising also want to have this information to help target and stay away from certain demographics, that kind of thing. But the platform providers are not interested in participating in that for variety of economic and cultural reasons, whatever. I'm curious, has anyone done an analysis of how much more effective or efficient they could be at the types of analysis, like if you were inside of Twitter and had access to all the metadata and not just the content and the very sketchy metadata that you have as an outside researcher or a researcher inside, how much higher quality analysis could they do to provide that information?
I mean, sorry, I'm losing my voice. I mean, so if I were inside like these companies, I just want like not having to scrape their data or like use the like little bit or do what we have to do now where you like email someone is like, hey, I see you did some Twitter work. Do you still have that? Can you share it with me? I know it's old, but like it's what we've got now. I actually wanted to do a project with some summer students on like looking back in 2016 at the like Taylor Swift Kanye West feud to understand if there were like Russian troll bots that were used in the election that were hijacking that conversation to get clout to do their other propaganda, because I suspect there was. I think, and it was like just a fun student project, right? And I was like, this will be easy, and it's like not easy because you can't get access to those tweets anymore at all. Like, so yeah, I mean, maybe like more metadata, but just like not even the metadata, just the data. like that's the thing. Like it's like the API's access and just the ability for researchers to get data at all is a problem. So, but yeah. Yeah.
So all of the professional conspiracy theorists I know, or at least the geriatric ones, seem to get all of their information from Telegram groups.
Okay.
Have you considered looking at Telegram? Because I'm pretty sure like they have like an official bot API you could use. I don't know if you actually get into those groups, but
I mean, Telegram stuff, we've done a little bit of work with Telegram. We did some work looking at Telegram and Instagram, actually, like how people were using reciprocal interaction to boost that. We haven't done it as much in conspiracy. I think Cameron, who's the lead student on and is now graduated with his master's, I think he's done some more work. I don't know if he's done any Telegram work recently. But yeah, we looked at YouTube largely because it hadn't been studied by other people. I think there has been some other work on some of the Telegram stuff. I think that, and it is the case that I think that they may have built some of these data sets of the YouTube channels from these Telegram pieces, some of that other research. So it's all connected, right? The ecosystem. But in a lot of cases, YouTube is one of people's first entrees into this. And then I also know that, yeah, Max, who's another NYU student who is in our larger group, worked on a little bit on, he has a paper called The Gospel According to Q that I think does look at QAnon Telegram type stuff in particular, and that analysis, so yeah. All right, it is now after 11, so I should probably wrap up, but thank you all for your time. This has been a lot of fun, and I'll answer more questions later.